Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Welcome to the Metabolic Link. I'm your host, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, and today we have a special guest to bring you. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Venn-Watson. Stephanie is a veterinary epidemiologist and a public health scientist. She has over 40 patents and she has 70 peer-reviewed scientific publications. She has 2 decades of experience leading efforts to understand dolphin health, working with the Navy. Stephanie received her bachelor's degree in animal physiology and in neuroscience at UC San Diego. She did her doctor in veterinary medicine degree at Tufts University. Did a master's in public health from Emory University. She's also a serial entrepreneur and she's co-founder of C15. So, and this was new to me, that there's a C15 supplement that is, the ingredient is pentadecanoic acid. And this is an odd carbon essential fatty acid. And it's found in butter. It's found primarily in animal products. Low C15 levels are associated with poor metabolic health. If your levels are low or they do get low, that can wreck your metabolic health. Higher levels or boosting your levels with a supplement or foods that are rich in C15 has many health benefits, and we discussed that at length in this podcast here. But before we get started, I want to say a special thank you for supporting the sponsors of this episode. Our sponsors really make the Metabolic Link possible, so please visit their websites online. We carefully vet out every product that we promote on this podcast. And if you'd prefer to listen to an ad-free episode, please visit our medical education platform at membership.metabolicinitiative.com. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Venn-Watson. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Stephanie Venn-Watson. It is amazing to have you on the podcast. I have been reading your papers, all your papers, extensive list of publications on a topic that is super interesting to me. So welcome to the Metabolic Link podcast.
Great. Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, I always do a little research. I like to figure out where people came from, to figure out where, to understand their career and their path, to developing, different hypotheses and also different products that we'll talk about later. And there was an early experiment that you did, I think in 2007, where you were already, this is about 2 decades, you've been studying dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, and you have an observation of sustained hyperglycemia that you noticed that was producing what you call prolonged glucose tolerance in dolphins. And then you observed this over 6 to 72 hours of fasting in dolphins. And I was curious to that observation, and then we're going to kind of switch a little bit into, what you're doing with the U.S. Navy.
Yeah. So that discovery, Dom, that was alongside with Dr. Sam Ridgway, who wrote a book called The Dolphin Doctor. He's one of the original dolphin veterinarians back in the day. And we had actually gone through, Sam had this file cabinet, a steel file cabinet at the Navy that was filled with paper written graphs. Yeah. And we were going through Sam's files, and he had this folder that was titled, like hyperglycemia or glucose tolerance. And we had just started getting hints that maybe dolphins may have an interesting approach to glucose metabolism that mimics what happens in people. So I pulled out this folder, I sat with Sam, and literally it was the graph paper with handwritten graphs. And it showed this graph that is in this paper that you saw from 2007 of this sustained hyperglycemia seen in dolphins. And I was like, Sam, well, tell me what this was all about. And so this is a study they actually had done decades before, where they had basically provided dolphins with different amounts of glucose and as the same as you would, like pregnant women would be getting for to assess the same effects, like how long is your glucose levels and how well do you handle glucose. And so they did that with a number of dolphins back in the early 1970s, and they showed that dolphins had this prolonged, sustained hyperglycemia. And which is really interesting because in nature, dolphins really don't get exposed to glucose, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
their
yeah.
diet's like all protein.
Yeah.
And so it was something that you wouldn't normally get insight on. But what we found was that dolphins mimic basically this sustained hyperglycemia response of a person, for example, who had insulin resistance.
Mhm.
And that then opened up this whole world of looking at evolutionarily this parallel between large brained, long lived dolphins and mammals, between dolphins and humans. And long story short, it led to this hypothesis, shared hypothesis, that dolphins, knowing that dolphins were originally on land and then they moved into the water. And when they moved into the water, they basically moved from a carbohydrate environment, high carb environment, to a high protein environment. And that they evolved to get insulin resistance over
Mhm.
time to basically enable their bodies to make glucose, their liver to produce glucose to meet the needs that the brain needed. We think the same thing happened in humans during the ice age when we went from a high carb
Mhm.
to a high protein diet, and we dolphins and humans both developed insulin resistance as a good thing. But then with
Yes.
humans, when carbs came back into our diet and the ice froze, that all of a sudden became a problem when
Mhm.
we introduced a
Mhm.
lot of glucose. So, anyways, just really fun
Yeah.
story of how that one little folder in Sam's file cabinet resulted in this big discovery.
Yeah, yeah. I was looking at your papers, which is an extensive list of papers, and I saw this like 15 minutes before jumping on, and I was like, oh, I got to ask you about this because it made me think of physiological versus pathological, insulin resistance. So something that's not detrimental to health, but has a survival advantage, especially in bigger brained mammals, right? Where you need to have that sustained glucose energy to the big brain. So, well, this leads me to your fascinating work with the US Navy looking at dolphins. I guess this would be part of the Marine Mammal Program. Was this part of that? And maybe describe to our listeners the work you did with the US Navy that led to your
Sure.
current path.
So, unexpected path, Dominic, for others who might have heard me talk about this before, but I don't even know how to swim and ended up working at the Navy with dolphins. So, clearly, it was not the plan to go do this. And so, I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, and I was working with the CDC and World Health Organization, helping to set up infectious disease surveillance systems all over the world. So, fascinated with pattern recognition and diseases among different animal species. And so I was recruited then by the Navy about 20 years ago to then do the same thing, look for patterns of health and disease in this long lived population of dolphins that the Navy has had. They've had a sustained population of about 100 bottlenose dolphins for over 60 years, Dominic. So they've lived
Yeah.
in the open ocean. The Navy it takes extraordinarily good care of them. And the
Mhm.
spin out benefit of that is that we then had half a century of health data on dolphins, including blood samples that were routinely taken to monitor their health as often as 4 times a year throughout their whole lives. So
Mhm.
this basically enabled us to go in and so the Navy has cared for these dolphins 60 years. They help find underwater objects, enemy swimmers. They're really good at what they do. They live in the open ocean, get great care. So that, and a testament to that is the fact that they brought on a veterinary epidemiologist to understand, really at that point it was aging dolphins.
Hmm. Yeah, I know the Office of Navy Research, they have a pretty, well, they did in the past, maybe not as much now, but a pretty robust, yeah, dolphin program. And that's, they're sort of leveraging their echolocation, their ability to find things, to detect things. And so you're coming in and you're looking at them because they're kind of like wild or they're maybe like semi-domesticated, but they're living out in nature more or less in a sanctuary, right? So, and they're treated very well. And because of that, they live longer than would be in the wild, I guess, right? Because dolphins live maybe 20 to 30 years, I guess, but they live quite a bit longer in this. So you're kind of brought in to understand age-related chronic diseases, which is a feature in these dolphins because they do live longer. So maybe, yeah, explain a little bit about that.
Right. So exactly, just like you said, Dom, you hit it. So the wild dolphins live on average to about 20 years. At the Navy, they're routinely living 40 to 50, and I was even just told to 60
Wow.
years old, which is really amazing. And so it's what happens when you take, you have access to healthcare and you're
Mhm.
protected. You have this sanctuary, you have this place that you can be and be safe. So because of that, because they had this growing population of aging geriatric dolphins, over a period of 10 years, we were starting to see some interesting patterns. And it was that we were seeing that some older Navy dolphins were developing conditions that are going to sound pretty familiar, right? Like chronic high cholesterol and chronic inflammation, and even changes in the brain consistent with Alzheimer's and fatty liver disease. And what was important, Dom, is that we were seeing that some dolphins, aging dolphins, were developing these conditions while others were not. So that provided a really unique opportunity and a very clean population because they are living in the open bay in San Diego Bay and they eat fish, but so much better controlled environment than humans, right? So that enabled us to go in and basically use an advanced technology, which you know well is called metabolomics, to look at which small molecules in their all fish diet and in their blood predicted the healthiest aging dolphins. And that's where, we had hypothesized it was going to be omega-3s because
Yep.
they eat fish. And
Yep.
instead, we were surprised to find that the top predictor of the healthiest aging dolphins was C15, pentadecanoic acid, an odd chain saturated fatty acid.
This episode of the Metabolic Link is brought to you by Genova Connect. Knowing your essential and metabolic fatty acid levels are key to maintaining your body's overall health. Achieving the right balance of fatty acids can help reduce inflammation, support heart health, and also improve mitochondrial function. Genova's comprehensive fatty acid test provides a detailed report, including omega 3s, omega 6s, and also C15, to help identify the potential imbalances in these fatty acids. High levels of these fatty acids are associated with an increase in life expectancy of 4 to 5 years. So these fatty acids are an evidence-based longevity biomarker we should be tracking. In partnership with Fatty 15, Genova also offers a focused single marker test for C15, an essential fatty acid that has been linked in numerous studies with healthy aging. Take control of your health by visiting gdx.net/ the metabolic link to learn more and use the code metabolic link for 15% off any of the test kits. Now back to our interview. So yes, this is it was brought to my attention maybe about a year ago, which and it is an essential fatty acid. Is that right? Is that what you said? This odd chain, it's essential fatty acid. Yeah, pentadecanoic acid, and it's a saturated fat and odd carbon. I think of like palmitic acid, and maybe that's 16, right? And then stearic, which is 18, I think.
That's right.
So kind of similar to that. But can you describe sort of what's unique about this fatty acid and the levels, I guess, also just from my perspective, like if you were to do lipidomics on it, like what would the levels be relative to other fats like docosahexaenoic or DHA or EPA? Like are the levels relatively small and it's very potent in small amounts, or yeah, maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yes. So first, yes. So yes, essential fatty acid for C15, and we published that work back in 2020 in Nature
Mhm.
Scientific Reports,
Mhm.
where once we found that association in dolphins of higher C15, better aging dolphins, we then moved pure free fatty acid C15 into the lab. We did 8 studies over 3 years. And we did this in collaboration with Dr. Ed Dennis, who is a
Hmm.
leader in
Yep.
fatty acids, head of the editor of Journal of Lipid Research for 15
Yep.
years. And so we did those studies. And at the end of it, Don, what we found was that the C15 was not only a beneficial and active fatty acid, but that it was meeting these rare criteria of being essential, which means that our bodies have to have certain levels of it to maintain our baseline health. And if we don't have enough of it, we fall apart. And we can talk about this deficiency syndrome that we've recently published. Um, but our bodies can't make enough of it on its own, which means that we have to get it from our diet. So
Hmm.
that makes it meet the criteria of essentiality. What we now know is the level, right? Because if it's truly essential, just like you said, there should be a defined level that our bodies need to maintain that health. And so we now know it's very small. It's like you said, it is far more potent than
Hmm.
EPA, DHA, and the omegas. We need to have greater than among of all fatty acids in our cell membrane, we need to have at least 0.2% of those fatty acids need to be C15. So if we
Uh-huh.
talk about concentration, that's equal to about 20 micromolars or 5 micrograms per mil. If we're
Hmm.
above that, then our cells are stable. We see normal function. Below that, we start developing what's called cellular fragility syndrome, which we can go into detail about as desired.
Uh-huh. And so this is a component of a normal healthy diet that has an abundant amount of uh full fat dairy products, right? Ruminant meat, I think, like beef and then obviously seafood has it in it, right? I mean, the dolphins are getting
Right.
it from seafood. Uh, so there's that. But where if we were to do like a tracer-based fate association study, like in radio label, like the carbons of C15, where does it end up? Does it end up in the cell membrane, the mitochondrial membrane? Where does the fatty acid go? And is it
It,
oxidized as energy too?
so it is very effective in getting in all kinds of nooks and crannies. So when you
Hmm.
do go from metabolomics to lipidomics, Dom, that's where we see like, oh, it's in all kinds of species.
Hmm.
So it gets into, all the different LPs. And so it's effective at getting into these different lipid species. We're learning more and more, we and others around the world are learning more and more about these specific lipid species, what happens when there's a 15 carbon tail onto it. So, for example, there was a study that was published last year that was looking at epigenetic clocks, right, and
Hmm.
biological aging rates, and they showed that people who had higher LPEs, lysophosphatidylethanolamide
Hmm. Yep.
lipid
Hmm.
species with C15 on it had slower biological aging than their chronological age. So that's just one example of when C15 gets incorporated into others. But if we talk about pure C15, its main role, its primary role is as its pure in its free fatty acid form, and that includes its role in being incorporated into our cell membranes, with and as well as the mitochondrial membranes. And what's really important about it is as a saturated fat, it has no double bonds, which means it is not susceptible to oxidation and lipid
Hmm.
peroxidation. So it's a big, simple role that it has is serving as a fatty acid that stabilizes our cell
Hmm.
membrane and simply makes it stronger against premature breakdown,
Hmm.
which is very different. It's the opposite of polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6s. While there are, essential fatty acids in that category, they almost serve as a yin and yang, where omega-3 and omega-6s have multiple double bonds in them. They are susceptible to oxidation, but they're flexible. So it's kind of a yin and yang of omegas provide flexibility to the cell membrane. C15 provides stability and resilience, which I know you love
Uh-huh.
the resilience part.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah. So as an odd, it's highly resistant to oxidation, if at all, right? So
That's
yeah,
right.
that's interesting. And maybe you touched on it, but is it oxidized as fuel at all? Does it get metabolized as like, do the carbons come out in CO2, I guess, if you're going to do like a study, do we know that?
They do. So
Uh-huh.
that what happens is what's really fascinating about, because like when we talk about saturated fats, we now know, because we just talked about the difference between unsaturated fatty acids and saturated fats, but now we know that not all saturated fats are created equal. So C15 is an odd chain, like we've been talking about, and then like you had mentioned, palmitic is a C16. That's an even
Hmm.
chain saturated
Yep.
fat. And so what we know between the two of them is that higher levels of even chain saturated fatty acids are associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart
Hmm.
disease, everything we've been taught. But the odd chains are the opposite. So not only in dolphins, but in people, higher levels of C15, C17, lower risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease. So when we get to how it is metabolized, the big question is what? Like how can
Yeah.
one
I didn't know
carbon
that.
make a
Yeah.
difference? How
Yeah.
could even chains be good? How could C16 be bad and C15 be so good? And what we've
Hmm.
learned is that when we metabolize them, in general, we metabolize these fatty acids by two carbons at a time. So they break down. So an
Hmm.
odd always stays an odd. So it goes C15, 13,
Yeah.
11, and even always stays even. So at the end of the line, it ends up becoming oxidized down to or metabolized down to propionic acid,
Hmm.
which again is a beneficial fuel feeder and that
Hmm.
we can put to work. So that was the reason why these two are behave so differently. Go nature
Yeah.
for figuring that out.
That is amazing. So it does have some very unique qualities in regard to insulin sensitivity, has anti-inflammatory effects. It favorably impacts lipid profile, like lowering triglycerides, maybe an elevation of HDL, maybe lower LDL. And then mitochondrial efficiency too has studies look at that, like mitochondrial function and efficiency. So maybe some of the research on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's so we have discovered, and as you would expect of an essential fatty acid, that C15 is pleiotropic, which means it has
Mhm.
lots of roles. A lot of people like prefer the word promiscuous. So it's C15 is
Mhm.
really good at doing a lot of different things. And so you went through a really nice list, Dom. With regard to mitochondrial function, we know that C15 can go in part because C15 helps increase the production of succinate. That helps allow, when our mitochondria are making energy, there's this respiratory chain, right? And so there are four steps to it, or four complexes. And usually you have to go through complex 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to make the energy.
Mhm.
As we get older and with chronic diseases, complex 1 is often the part that breaks down, and then that has results in the whole like chain being shut down. What C15 is able to do is it helps produce succinate, which then can feed
Okay.
directly into
Mhm.
complex 2. So it
Yep.
creates basically a bypass rescue system to get our mitochondria back and running. And then we were able to show that back in that scientific reports paper that when you feed basically a broken mitochondrial cell, a cell with broken mitochondria, you feed it C15 and it reduced reactive oxygen species by 45% and increased ATP production. So that's
Mhm.
a pretty cool little trick. We talked about it stabilizing cell membranes with regard to a lot of the lipid lowering and metabolic and immune anti-inflammatory benefits. We know that C15 activates PPAR alpha delta. So these
Mhm.
are well-known receptors for balancing metabolism and immunity. It's also a JAK-STAT inhibitor, which is one of
Mhm.
my
Mhm.
favorite
Yep.
activities of C15 because it's so exciting from an anti-inflammatory perspective, anti-cancer. It also has
Cancer. Yeah.
HDAC inhibitor, which is
Yep.
another anti-cancer.
Hmm.
So it all feeds to it has all of these mechanisms. I guess two more with regard to longevity. It activates AMPK and it inhibits mTOR. So it's
Mhm.
this whole package that if you have this toolbox, right, of abilities, it will help you live healthier longer. And
Mhm.
that is what evolution has been, how mammals, long-lived mammals have evolved to live longer is through molecules like
Yeah.
C15. So it's a really nice toolbox for longevity.
Yeah, in regard to longevity, I think there was a paper, if I remember correct, where it was compared to rapamycin, metformin, and acarbose, I think. So there was some like comparative studies on that. Maybe explain like, and I think there was using human cell line. So maybe explain some of the longevity studies, comparing it to, I mean, the gold standard, right, of longevity molecules. I think maybe this is a more recent publication, but maybe explain some of the results there.
Sure. So this study came from the idea came from when I was chatting with Dr. Nick Shork, and Nick is head of the NIH funded longevity consortium.
Mhm,
And we've been introduced to Nick back when we were working with the dolphins, and we did a really cool paper where he's like, "Oh, I bet with the dolphin data you could answer what everyone knows, but no one's been able to prove." Which is that individuals age at different rates, even within the same environment. That it's not
mhm,
just you age faster if you smoke, that there's actually that you can catch it. So we published that in PNAS a while back in the dolphin showing that.
mhm,
And then, so then as we were doing this work down, then Nick said he was like, oh, he goes, because we had just compared it to pure EPA omega-3 and showed that it had 3 times more cellular benefits. He's like, oh, I wonder what happened if you actually did the same comparison of pure C15 against longevity molecules, because I bet C15 is a geroprotector, that it is actually going to protect against chronic diseases, which I think we all agree would help us live longer. So then we ran that study, and we used a panel called Biomap, and it's 12 human cell systems that mimic various disease states. And what happens is it's like heart disease and liver disease and fibrosis and inflammation and different targets, and it has 146 different biomarkers across these 12 human cell systems. And pharma companies use it to be able to test molecules for potential efficacy, right? And
mhm,
safety too,
mhm.
because if it kills human cells, kind of want to know that out of the
Yep.
gate. So we did, it's at 4 concentrations in each of the systems, because you also want to see a dose dependent significant changes.
Mhm,
And we ran it against exactly like you said, the three leading longevity molecules, rapamycin, acarbose, and metformin. And that's where we found that C15 had 36 dose dependent, clinically relevant benefits across 10 out of 12 disease systems. So this is huge, and it was safe. So it's just
yeah.
like the person who was leading the biomap at the time at this company, it's a third independent third party. She actually reached out to us, and she's like, I want to make sure you know what you're sitting on. She's like, we very rarely see a molecule with this level of safety and efficacy across so many systems. So she's
Mhm,
just like, please don't give up on this molecule. And
mhm,
we never were, but it was interesting. So rapamycin was the second closest. It had 32 clinically relevant benefits, and it actually helped across all 12 human cell systems, versus we had 10 out of 12.
mhm,
Metformin had about half as much of the benefits, and acarbose was kind of at the end of the line. But it made
mhm.
sense because acarbose doesn't necessarily work by having an impact at the cellular level. Its main job, right, is to prevent us from absorbing carbs and glucose at the
Yeah.
gut
Mhm.
level. So it made sense that all happened, but a very exciting outcome in which, when you look at rapamycin, like you had mentioned, it's the leading longevity enhancing
Mhm.
molecule. It has anti-fibrotic, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties, and antifungal, which is why it's called
Oh
rapamycin.
yeah. Yeah.
Its
Yeah.
original antifungal properties.
Yep.
And you look at C15, the exact same list, anti-cancer,
Mhm,
anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, antioxidant, and, a whole group, two groups doing tons of work on the anti-cancer properties.
mhm.
So it ends up that we maybe didn't have to go all the way to Easter Island to get this very complicated molecule rapamycin to trigger these longevity pathways. It's a molecule we all get from birth, from milk.
Yeah. Our tap water can be a significant source of toxic exposure. And this includes public drinking water. And in our case, we have a private well. So it's really important to understand the safety of your drinking water because we have industrial solvents, we have heavy metals, we have in an agricultural area, we have pesticides, we have herbicides like glyphosate, for example. The AquaTrue purifiers can solve this problem by using a four-stage reverse osmosis purification process. So these are countertop water purification systems that work with no installation and there's no plumbing involved. It's just kind of plug and play. So unlike the filter that we were using, AquaTrue is independently tested by a number of organizations, not going to list them all, but IAPMO, NSF, ANSI. So they meet all these different standards, and these purification systems can remove over 80% of the most harmful contaminants. And that includes, basic things like chlorine, fluoride, arsenic, nitrate, and also PFAS. So PFAS are known as the forever chemicals. And we do know that long-term exposure to these forever chemicals in high concentrations can potentially lead to adverse effects like cancer, endocrine disruption, liver toxicity. So that's why I'm glad that AquaTrue really is very comprehensive and can remove PFAS, unlike most of the filtration systems on the market. So these filters are also they're affordable for one thing, and I really like that they are truly long lasting. For example, AquaTrue filters can last 6 months up to 2 years. So AquaTrue comes with a 30-day money back guarantee, makes it a great gift. Again, these are plug and play devices and they last a long time, and they're probably the most cost effective, comprehensive filtration systems that we find. So today, our listeners can get 20% off of an AquaTrue purifier. Just go to aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU.com and enter the code Metabolic Link at checkout. Now back to our interview. And rapamycin has side effects, right? Immune suppression, and it's dose dependent. So if I was to take 10 grams a day of C15, like, do we know, and that gets incorporated, into our membranes and things like that, is, you said there was a dose dependent effects, but it was relatively safe, at least in that experimental model. Do we know, has there been feeding studies where like a very large doses of this have been given, like gram quantities? And does this increase the benefits? Like, where did the benefits stop? If from a dose dependency point of view.
Right, because even water's toxic, right? With if
Yep.
you have enough of it. So we and others have done studies that have been 150 to 250 times the dose that we're currently using with regard to the C15 supplement and in the studies, and there was no toxicity found.
Mhm.
We held at that just because we just really needed to know, like, we have confidence in the dose that we need to get. So we said, well, let's just ensure that this range of doses is safe. So we stopped at that, Dom. We haven't seen,
Mhm.
there's another group who got to the gram level. They did not see toxicity either. In the cell-based studies, we haven't seen toxicity. So it's remarkably safe. And with regard to, looking at with like the clinical trials that have been done and the doses that we're using, it's 100. And importantly, there have been really extensive pharmacokinetic studies done with pure free fatty acid C15 in humans, including
Mhm.
children all the way up to adults. And it was actually done for a cystic fibrosis study. But they were able to show basically absorption. So we then knew that if we need to achieve, let's say, 20 micromolars of C15 in our blood, because this is the optimal dose, then
Mhm.
we need to get about 200 to 300 milligrams of this pure C15 per day. And that was
Okay.
just reconfirmed in a clinical trial that was just published by Jeff Schwimmer
Mhm.
with the pure C15 supplement. So it's great because it all makes sense.
Yeah.
It's what we used to get when we used to, Americans used to drink 2 cups of whole fat milk per day, and
Yeah.
that is 200 milligrams of C15.
Oh, okay. So that's good to know. I have a couple well, one of my questions was, yeah, I get about maybe a half cup of, or maybe a full cup of sour cream every day, a pound of beef, and like a pound of salmon. Like that's kind of literally what I ate yesterday, or maybe mackerel or sardines instead of salmon. But so I guess my question would be, yeah, would there be any benefits to go above that? And also people that are on a plant-based diet or just say a purely vegan diet, is this something found only in animal products? And in a vegan diet, would there be a potential deficiency here?
Yeah,
Do plants make it, I guess? Yeah.
great question. So let me start with the longevity part, and then we'll go to the deficiency part.
Okay.
So it's in, we talked earlier that we need about this 0.2% of C15 in our blood and our cells among all fatty acids to be healthy, so be normal. So the question is, can we optimize that, right? And so there are a couple of studies that are really encouraging that we can actually push C15 levels higher and leverage what millions of years of evolution have done to extend longevity in mammals. Can we extend longevity in individuals?
Mhm.
And one great study came from Sardinia. So it's a blue longevity zone. It's where the most men that live over 100 years old on Earth exist. And their C15 levels, Dom, are zero point 0.6. So they have 3 times higher
Every
C15
time. Yeah.
than the average person in the world. And they, interestingly, live longer because they are less likely to die of heart disease. Now, there was a separate study that was done by a big group and included groups from folks from Harvard, and they did a long term prospective cohort study in which they found that people with C15 levels between zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.6 were less likely to develop heart disease. So we have two different studies and its association, but when we know C15's activities and what it can do, it really supports the fact that C15 can actively extend and support longevity at the very least, because by stemming off the onset of heart disease. So really encouraging, and people can get their C15 levels measured by their physicians, their fatty acid panels that have been around for a long time. They
Yep.
increasingly include C15, so just make sure that they include C15. And I just got my results back, and I am 0.46, proud to
Wow.
say,
Hmm.
of C15 levels. So that's the longevity side. For the deficiency side, I think C15 is going to play out a lot like B12, which is, as you're, hinting to, Dom, that this is a really an animal product driven nutrient. There is some C15 in plants, but not enough to be able to get us to that 0.2% and above. Some things that are encouraging would include a study showing that, there have been a lot of studies showing that fiber helps with regard to glucose metabolism, lowering the risk of fatty liver disease, things like that. There was a group that did a study and they showed that fiber has that specifically inulin within fiber
Hmm.
helps our microbes in our gut make C15. And it's that production of
Hmm.
C15 that provides the
Oh.
metabolic benefits of fiber. So it was like, so that's a non-animal. So I think it's a combination. So like for me, I mix whole grain and fiber with I'm not afraid of cheese, and I am a huge salmon and fish lover. So, and
Hmm.
then along with the supplementation, it means that we can get to these optimal levels. But
Hmm.
almost unquestionably, if you're a pure vegan, you will be C15 deficient.
Hmm.
So yeah, being able to find a way to, help fix that will be really important.
So, yeah, so now we can test for it. And did you just mention that the body, through prebiotic fiber, can synthesize some
Yeah.
C15? Is that
Yeah,
right? But it's essential, but I guess conditionally essential
that's
yeah, okay.
that's
Okay.
right. So yeah, so to clarify, it's like that being essential means that your body doesn't make enough of it to reliably sustain like healthy levels. And so
Hmm.
there are increasing understanding, even acromansia, right?
Hmm.
That also a paper just came out a few weeks ago showing that acromansia makes C15. So there's
Hmm.
some, and so having a healthy gut, yet another reason for having a healthy gut
Yeah.
microbiome is for C15 production, but it's really not enough to be able to get us up and over that healthy state where we were really meant
Hmm.
to be omnivores.
Yeah.
And our bodies are still needing that nutrient.
Yeah. And if we're going to rank the foods like highest C15, I guess would it be full fat dairy and then maybe ruminant animals or and then seafood, or would seafood be at the top? I presume.
Yeah, it depends on the sea. So for sure, above and beyond, almost like category one, two, and three would be dairy fat.
50 to 75% of American adults are deficient in magnesium. It is by far the most the electrolyte that is deficient in most Americans more than anything else. So I was one of them. I had a low magnesium level, and this is especially true, important for our low carb community because ketogenic diets and carnivore diets are by nature of the foods are deficient in magnesium. So, for example, superfoods like steak, eggs, and even liver are very low in magnesium, and this is in part due to why my blood levels were low. Mellow magnesium by Ned is a super blend of magnesium that contains the three most bioavailable forms of magnesium and nutrient dense forms that are a form of chelated magnesium that cause no GI problems. They're highly absorbable. And this combination of magnesium is combined with GABA and also L-theanine. So I take the supplement for energy, for relaxation, for focus. Especially at the end of the day, I take it literally as a pre-workout. I mix it with creatine. It actually enhances creatine absorption and utilization in the body. As you may know, magnesium is involved in hundreds of metabolic reactions. So if you want to optimize your metabolism, if you want to optimize your hormone levels, ensure that your magnesium levels are optimal. So become the best version of yourself with magnesium, ensuring that you're not deficient. And our listeners to this podcast will get 15% off NED products. That's NED products. You get 15% off if you use the code Metabolic Link. So go to Hello Ned, that's helloned.com/metabolic link. Enter the code metabolic link at checkout. So that's HelloNed.com/metabolic link to get your 15% off.
C15 is such a reliable source of C15 of sorry, dairy fat is such a reliable source of C15 for us that for a long time, C15 has actually been used as a biomarker for how much dairy fat we eat in studies.
Oh, wow.
No, everyone thought it was just an inactive biomarker of dairy fat. So
Yeah.
that's our main source of it. But interestingly, we're now learning that it's not just the amount of dairy fat. Obviously, whole fat milk has C15. Non-fat milk has no C15 in it. We now know that cows that are fed grass have twice as much C15 in their milk fat than
Hmm.
cows fed corn. And the higher the altitude the grass that a ruminant eats,
Wow.
the more C15 they have. So there are things we can be
Interesting.
doing to
Yeah.
positively affect the amount of C15 in dairy fat, which is also really exciting because we can push for agricultural changes. And one of the things we're really pushing for is, hey, if we have the dairy industry actually report on their label how much C15 is in their
Mhm.
product, I mean, we'll help drive demand for that,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be able to do the practices that make maybe the cows happier too, and make the milk fat more C15 rich.
Mhm. So you piqued my interest, this altitude induced C15 level in the
Yeah.
is there I mean what's the is there a mechanism there or a link to that? Is it the types of grass that grow at altitude or is it Is it the barometric pressure or?
Yeah, I think it's both. And you're gonna
Okay.
love the hypothesis.
Hmm.
We think it's resilience, right? So it's
Oh, okay.
just
Yeah. Hmm.
about, yeah, you need to be tougher grass to
Hmm.
live at higher altitudes. And we have seen this repeated in, for example, bacteria like Listeria. Uh, is one of the very rare bacteria that can actually grow in the
Hmm.
refrigerator, right? And that's why deli
Yeah.
meats and you see these outbreaks with refrigerated foods
Yes.
usually.
Yep.
So, but Listeria is particularly good at growing in refrigerated temperatures.
Hmm.
One of the mechanisms Listeria uses to make itself resilient at lower temperatures is C15. So it uses pentadecanoic.
Oh,
Same thing for thermophiles. So when you look at bacteria living in the vents in the bottom of the ocean where it's super hot, they're using
yeah. Like
super resilient saturated
a
fats.
biofilm or something to,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, interesting. So I think of another fatty acid that's, I think, in high concentrations in dairy, conjugated linoleic acid. So that's
Mm-hmm.
another one. I remember hearing about it just back, God, in the 90s, I think, CLA, so
Yeah.
that's another. So there are a lot of fatty acids that have unique concentrations in dairy. So if one is consuming, so this brings up the question a lot of people are probably thinking about, if they are consuming high amounts of, a lot of people, in that we know in the community kind of tend to avoid dairy, even in the carnivore keto camp because of, potential dairy allergens and things like that. But if you're consuming high amounts of animal products, do you think there'd be any additional benefit to including a C15 supplement on top of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is going to sound like a biased answer, but there are actually reasons why. And there was actually a group that got together of nutritional experts, specifically in the dairy fat arena. And they got together in Denmark and gathered to help answer this question of, we know there are nutrients within dairy fat, like CLA, like you mentioned, like, now we know C15. A lot of the
Mhm.
vitamins that were discovered because they're in milk. I mean, it's nature's perfect food. Is what every mammal gets at birth.
Mhm.
So, but the question is that as we get older, we're eating dairy fat, eating high fat diets throughout our life. If C15 is so beneficial, knowing C15's benefits, why aren't we cleanly seeing those benefits from people who eat more dairy, for example, compared to those who don't?
Mhm.
So what they concluded after reading all the studies is, first, just eating fat, dairy fat or meat fat, um, doesn't provide the benefits of an individual nutrient that's within it, that you're seeing in the lab. So there was a
Sure.
Bishop
Mhm.
et al., right? So they actually gave a mouse model of fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes. They gave it pure C15, pure C17, and then milk fat. And what they showed is, C15 was the best, had all the benefits that we had shown. C17 was okay, kind of middle of the road, and the milk fat mice got worse. So they had their fatty liver disease was worsened and they had more inflammation. So but there are studies also showing that eating more fat and milk fat is beneficial. So it's just that what they concluded is just very messy and it's
Mhm.
not consistent. So, and then the last study I'll share, is that there are a couple of studies that showed that high fat diets can actually lower C15 levels. And this is in mice.
Mhm.
And this was a quandary because there's C15 in the high fat diets they were eating. So it should have been higher. And the hypothesis is that if you have a whole lot of fat at one time and C15 is there, C15 is only present at 1 to 3% of all the fat that's
Yeah.
there. And it's basically getting out competed for absorption. And so it's more likely to get passed through. We absorb less C15, the more fat that's in our diet, and that results in lower C15 levels. So that's a long way of
Yeah.
answering up.
No,
That's why supplementation with C15 actually allows, the whole reason we developed this in cooperation with the Navy and all this research that we did, funded by the Office of Naval Research, is to provide, how can we find a way to provide just the good Goldilocks odd chain essential fatty acid
Mhm.
without having to compete and in a very bioavailable form. So that was
Yeah.
the whole reason. And wonderfully, it was for dolphins,
Yeah.
first,
Yeah.
but it ends up, well, good, a nice delight and surprise. It's helping us too.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a follow-up question that I had was that, yeah, consuming a certain amount of fat, it's all about the ratios, and that needs to be appreciated that, like the omega 6 to 3 ratio or 3 to 6 ratio, that needs
Exactly.
to be like you could get large amounts of omega 3s, but if the omega 6, overwhelm that, if your diet's really high in fat, it's that ratio is probably the most important thing. And other things I think about too, like certain nutrients found in meat. For example, the most studied, the supplement that has more research than any other supplement by far in the world is creatine monohydrate. And you could eat meat, and if you're on a vegan diet, you're going to be a hyper responder to creatine monohydrate, like 3, 5, 10 grams. But even if you have a animal-based diet, we know that if you take 10 grams per day, for example, that has big effects on cognitive function and things like that. So, because there's certain additional benefits to getting this, natural product, above and beyond what you can derive from food. So, it would be interesting. Yeah, I could see how, just eating a keto diet, especially in certain kinds of fats, can be counterproductive because those ratios are important. So one way to increase the ratios would be to supplement, especially if you're not a big fan of full fat dairy or avoiding dairy for some reason or just not eating meat or gravitate towards a plant-based diet, which seems like there's a big trend in some camps to doing that. So so just like for my own knowledge, like if do you know, by the way, like what the level of C15 would be like in a pound of beef? Like, do you know the approximate levels that would be? I'm just trying to gauge my C15
Yeah.
consumption for the day, or maybe a
So you would get, I'm trying to, I think it's the chart I have, Dom, is by ounces of
okay, yeah,
three
16 ounces.
ounce.
Okay. Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's a 3 ounce serving that
Yeah.
I think 3 ounces had like 50 milligrams. So yeah,
Okay. Yeah,
so
three
so
times
you would,
five. Yeah,
yeah,
150. Okay. Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
you would get your daily C15 from there. And again,
Yeah.
it's the
And it
same.
depends on the type of beef too, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Like first,
yeah,
so if
super
you
interesting.
were to choose like the highest C15 meat, it would be Australian grass-fed beef or lamb. And lamb was
Wow.
actually the
Okay.
highest. So
Okay.
again, Australia's even when you look at mother's milk levels in
Mhm.
humans, they vary. C15 levels vary based upon the cultural diet, and which means
Yeah.
that's how much C15 baby gets. Australian women have some of the highest C15 levels in their milk, and it's because the practice in Australia is almost all of their dairy and meat is coming from grass-fed
Hmm.
ruminants.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe you could give the listeners like some recommendations as far as like supplementation and things like that, and how kind of how you derived fatty 15 and how that became sort of a passion to make this amazing molecule accessible to people as a supplement and now an essential nutrient. So that we know. So
Right, right.
maybe a little.
So sure. So yeah, we developed Fatty 15 again as part of an endeavor from Office of Naval Research to help solve for some of the problems of how, okay, we know that C15 is essential. How can we reliably get it into our bodies, knowing, all these other complicated things we've talked about. And we're military. So, Eric and my husband is a physician, Navy physician, and I, we broke off from the military to develop and commercialize this product. And it's just really because this is what you do in the military. It's like you have
Mhm.
a problem,
Yeah.
you find a way to fix
Hmm.
it, and then you fix it. So versus kind of leaving it. So it's been a
Hmm.
joy to do that. And it was 10 years of science really before we brought C15 to the market. We were initially developing it as a pharmaceutical for fatty liver disease.
Hmm.
And then once we were understanding that this was meeting the criteria of an essential fatty acid, Dom, then we're like, okay, no, our whole community was saying, you need to bring this to the people. And
Hmm.
so, and the best way to do that in the first step is as a supplement. So yeah, so we developed C15, this pure C15 ingredient, and we recommend that people start with 100 milligrams per day. So it's a super small, tiny pill. I
Hmm.
open up the capsule and I melt it in my coffee in the morning. And half of our customers feel benefits. They feel better within 2 weeks, which is
Hmm.
not what we were expecting because this is about long-term health. But if people are sitting on deficiencies, and most of us are right at that cliff of 0.2%, I think the fact that we're replenishing C15 that our body needs is resulting in a more immediate effect. There was just one added piece of science that we discovered along the way, because when I started taking it, I was sleeping better and my joint pain went away. And
Hmm.
I was like, okay, this is placebo. But then we started getting the same feedback from a lot of people. And that's when we discovered, we went back to the dolphin metabolomics and we found a metabolite called pentadecanoic carnitine, or PDC.
Hmm.
It's an acyl carnitine, and it ends up, it's the second ever discovered full acting endocannabinoid. So it fully
Oh,
activates
wow.
CB1 and CB2. So it's like,
Okay.
oh, exactly. It's like better sleep, less joint pain. So it's we have these receptors in our brain and body, not for cannabis. It's not how we've
Hmm.
evolved to have
Yeah.
it. It's for endocannabinoids, molecules our bodies make. And this is the second ever discovered that fully activate. So a lot of reasons we need C15 is not just for our metabolic, liver, and heart health, but our mental health and our sleep. And all of a sudden, things start coming together, right? So at 100 milligrams, I was experiencing all of those benefits, the sleep benefits and lower glucose, lower liver enzymes. And then, but people can go to 200 milligrams per day. I was on about 15, 100 milligrams a day for about a year and a half. And then menopause really started kicking in for me,
Hmm.
as did the joint pain that comes with menopause. And when I went to two capsules, Dom, the joint pain went away completely. So for me,
Hmm.
I'm on 200 milligrams a day
Yeah.
for those benefits. And also, now that we can measure C15 levels, knowing that I'm really at that, Sardinian healthy
Hmm.
zone.
Yeah, that would be a good range to shoot for. So you mentioned that you take the capsule and then you put it into coffee to melt it. And I did notice that when I took it actually took a whole like month off of the gym because I was traveling nonstop and everything. And then when I came back from travels, I set up my yearly DEXA scan, and I was like paranoid that I was gonna like, I don't know that was gonna reflect me just taking time, a month or so away from the gym. But I had taken the Fatty 15 during that whole time, and not that, but I was really kind of happy to see my DEXA scan that I like was able to maintain lean body even being out of the gym for. So maybe that had a factor there. But you mentioned, and I do remember it's like a white powder in a capsule, so it's solid at room temperature. And you mentioned kind of melting it into your
Yeah.
coffee. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So most people, like 99% of our customers, because it's such a tiny pill, they just take it as a
Hmm.
capsule. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, it is a solid white powder, no smell, no taste,
Yeah.
extremely stable. Like the whole point of its role in our body also plays out on our shelf too. So it's a very
Yeah.
stable molecule. I don't know why. No reason. But I enjoy it with
Okay.
my coffee. I get an extra, pick me up in the morning that lasts throughout the whole day.
Hmm.
So again, most people just take it as a capsule, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the best route of administration, I guess. So, well, I know we're coming up on time now. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners? Maybe some future research that you're doing with this compound and where they can find you and where they can learn more about what you're doing.
Sure. So, future research. Oh, so exciting. So, the world now has C15, at their fingertips, not just people, consumers and individuals, but researchers. And so, there's a lot of research going on. Nick Shork, who I talked about, Dr. Shork from the Longevity Consortium. He was just at ARDD, which was one of the biggest, aging research and drug development meeting in Copenhagen, and it's
Uh-huh.
the meeting of the biggest bigwigs in longevity scientists meet. And Nick was there, and he presented C15 as the leading longevity molecule above
That's
all
awesome.
else.
Hmm.
And so, which was awesome. And so he's like, when he came back from the meeting, he's like, Steph, like cat's out of the bag. Everyone's working on C15. And so we've already had people like Rich Miller, who leads the ITP, the mouse longevity study. So
Hmm.
Rich is now
Yep.
working with C15. So we're really excited of not just the work that we're doing, but the world is working on C15. I'd say
Mhm.
just today, a paper came out showing a mouse model with of inflammatory bowel disease that C15 lowered inflammation in these models. So it's just fun seeing
Mhm.
really the world place the essentiality of C15 out. We in January hope to be able to share some exciting research on the Alzheimer's front.
Yep.
So stay tuned for that. It's receptors and cell systems. So,
Hmm.
need to start at an early stage, but some really encouraging news on that front. So we're working on that. In addition to in a part because some dolphins are developing, like these early Alzheimer's. And so again,
Yep.
it's this wonderful supporting dolphin and human health at the same time, which
Yep.
is great. And last, it's just a movement. A movement's on. We can't put C15 is not going back in the bag. Like we can't explain it away. We've got to have these conversations. We need researchers working on it. We need to be talking about it. From a regulatory standpoint, we need to revisit our nutritional guidelines because we're
Yep.
creating nutritional C15 deficiencies. We need to get those fixed. And thank you for being part of the
Yeah.
movement. You're in it, Dom,
Well,
like
thank
it or
you.
not.
Yeah. I made a lot of notes reading your papers. So I mean, we're very interested in developing like a personalized, engineered kind of low carb ketogenic diet for different applications. So, for example, making a ketogenic diet more palatable by incorporating allulose, which has maybe some anti-cancer effects as in a fructose epimer. And then the composition of the fatty acids, I think, are probably above all, the most important thing, like in a ketogenic diet, because it's fat based. So incorporating C15 into like a C15 enhanced ketogenic diet just seems to make a lot of sense, especially in the context of Alzheimer's and cancer and for the anti-inflammatory, for the mitochondrial benefits. If people want to get C50, can they just buy it, bulk on Amazon? And I know Fatty 15 has I know there's different ways that people can acquire this and synthesize it. And, you want to get it, the potency and purity is utmost importance. So maybe talk a little bit about, the best source of this fatty acid, C15.
Right. Well, of course, I have to say
Yeah.
fatty 15, right? So
Yeah.
fatty,
Yeah.
so people can find us at fatty15.com. For the pure free fatty acid, science backed, all the science I was talking about that was funded by ONAR was done with this molecule. So what people are eating are exactly what were done in the studies. And all the science behind peer-reviewed science, people really want to nerd out, is available at discoverc15.com. So that's where people can go and read and find a lot of studies. And then how we, again, we initially developed this as a pure ingredient in pharma grade to be used
Mhm.
as, for drug development. And so we do that by taking pure plant-based C14. So it is vegan friendly. So for people who, may be most susceptible to C15 deficiencies, this will work for you.
Mhm.
We take a plant-based C14 and we add a carbon onto it. So it's a very well-controlled process. It's bioidentical to the C15 in nature. And again, it's the exact molecule that was used in all these studies, and it's proprietary. So
Mhm.
all this discovery was done by the Navy,
Mhm.
and the Navy has well earned its patents for its use in supplements and food
Yep.
ingredients, and all of a percentage of our revenues, because we've licensed it from the Navy, goes
Mhm.
back to the Navy Dolphins. And they actually have
Oh,
an
cool.
Alzheimer's behavioral project of brain games for dolphins that they're developing with the funding that came from Fatty 15 sales.
Oh, that's awesome. So it's a U.S. Navy sort of intellectual property. Yeah, you are kind of inventor on it
Right.
as an inventor. I do really appreciate, having been funded by ONR since like 2004, I think that unlike the NIH where you just kind of do science for science, like the military has you as you know, they need to have a deliverable, right? So they
Right.
fund investigators like you to come up with something that has a really important practical application instead of just an NIH study can develop, a nature paper or a science paper or something like that. But the military tries to do both. Like they can, and
Right.
their main goal is something that can enhance human health, warfighter resilience, protection, and things like that. So that's they spearheaded our whole exogenous ketones sort of path on that. So it's really interesting to see how, military ONR, which is DoD funding under that, can develop the scientific path and lay out the groundwork of the scientific research to come up, to make these discoveries. So that's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
you wish
and I didn't
all
even know
research.
about it like a year ago. So it's like, yeah, it's relatively new to me. It's amazing how this didn't get on my radar being on it. So more people need to know about this. And I thank you so much for sharing, everything that you do. So maybe again, real quick, like just where people can find you and the best place to learn more about this.
Yeah, sure. So you go to fatty15.com. We're there. There's an Our Story page if you wanted to
Hmm.
nerd out. There's a
Yep.
TED Talk
Yep. TED
there
Talk's great.
to
Yep.
watch. So that's fun.
Hmm.
And then discoverc15.com to be
Hmm.
able to read out all the science. And we're busy updating it now because boy, there have been so many papers that have just come out in the last 3 6 months. So we'll be
Hmm.
updating it there
Yep.
as well. So this has been such a fun conversation, Dom. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Steph, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to share this with everybody. And yeah, I look forward to using your product, continuing to use that, and sharing this information with others. Thanks again
Excellent.
for being on our Metabolic Link podcast.
It was super fun. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Metabolic Link. If you like this episode, please be sure to leave us a review. Please share it and drop us a comment that helps us get the message out. If you want more content like this, including access to our private podcast feed that offers exclusive ad-free episodes, and also providing continuing medical education credits for physicians, please visit our medical education platform, The Metabolic Initiative, at membership.metabolicinitiative.com. Thank you again for listening.
Do you love learning about metabolic health? So do we. It's why we created the Metabolic Initiative, an online educational platform providing evidence-based education on metabolic health and therapies for healthcare professionals and the general public. By joining the Metabolic Initiative, you'll gain access to hundreds of expert lectures, interviews, panel discussions, and even private episodes of the Metabolic Link. CMEs are available. Go to metabolicinitiative.com to get started. And as always, thank you for listening to the Metabolic Link.